Welcome to the Sound Meets Sound podcast. This episode, I chat with librettist Kendra Preston Leonard and composer / mezzo-soprano Lisa Nair about their One Voice Project Micro Opera Festival. Thanks for joining me, Kendra and Lisa.
Yay!
We're here to talk about your One Voice Micro Opera Festival, which is very cool. Can you tell me a little bit more about what One Voice is and how that started and the inspiration for that?
Yeah,
that's all Lisa.
I'll start.
Okay.
It's been about 7 or 8 years now that I've been very interested in solo vocal performance within our sort of classical and classical aligned traditions, because, you know, every other friend of mine who plays other instruments has a solo unaccompanied repertoire that they regularly play that's part of the standard rep, and singers don't have that, you know. I was lucky enough to perform a few pieces by a friend of mine, a fellow composer, at a festival that were unaccompanied, and they were, you know, exciting and challenging and, you know, made me work and learn about my voice in different ways than I ever had, because all the repertoire I'd learned before had been with piano reduction, chamber. Usually the chamber music includes a piano or has a piano reduction. So like that was always such a huge part of the landscape of learning music as a soloist or as a chamber musician or as an opera musician. And the other thing I was finding was that there were a lot of opportunities as an emerging performer while I was finishing my doctorate and getting myself out there that, you know, maybe there was an opportunity to perform for a summer festival or perform for a community event, but these spaces were not always spaces with pianos. There was not always a pianist collaborator who was as equally excited about some of the opportunities as I was, so I was going to have to shell out money, understandably. Everybody, you know, needs to be compensated, but maybe for me it would have been worth it to sort of just put myself out there and build my resume and challenge myself. So without that, I was yearning for the autonomy I saw my flute player friends and my violinist friends, my cellist friends. So I started to curate, and I performed a whole concert called the One Voice Project, took it on tour in Iowa, slowly have been adding pieces to it. And then, you know, I think in the back of my mind, there was always this question, like, some of these pieces that were being written for me were of the very challenging contemporary music concert style that really didn't have a lot of allowance for like memorizing within a reasonable amount of practice time. But like how cool it would be to have repertoire that could be written with the idea of memorizing and of staging involved. And then enter Kendra and I starting to collaborate, which we met on Twitter. And then when was it, Kendra, that we actually started to sort of say, let's look for projects we can collaborate on?
Oh my gosh. It was
2 years ago or?
Yeah, it must have been maybe 2 years ago when Lisa had put out a call for texts for some work she was doing. And we got in touch that way. And she had this opportunity to write a piece this past year for Erwin Myers.
That's right.
Who was looking to do a concert, sort of a home concert, pieces that she could perform by herself or accompany herself with the piano, so with like very minimal piano. And so I had this poem that had been sitting around for a while, and it was very short and seemed to be just the right thing. And Lisa set that for Erwin, and so it's voice and it's clapping and it's stomping, and that really sort of got us started. And we thought, wow, there are so many other pieces we could do. And with the pandemic, we thought there's going to be a huge number of singers who really want to be able to perform something right now that doesn't require an orchestra, that doesn't require them to be on stage. And we've just gone from there.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for that background. And Kendra, I guess I'm just a little curious about how you got into, have you always written texts like poems and librettos? Well, not always, but how did you come into that?
I have always enjoyed writing. You know, I was the kid at school who liked doing the research and reading the 5 different editions of the book and writing the paper and doing things like that. But I wasn't really confident about doing creative writing for a very long time. And I started my career in music as a cellist, and then I stopped playing because I have a chronic illness called lupus that limits the mobility and use of my hands somewhat. And I became a musicologist and a theorist, and I love doing that. I still love that. I love the research, and I love analysis, and I love writing it up and sort of uncovering the mysteries and the history of music and people. But the year before I turned 40, I thought, if you want to try something creative, you don't really have anything holding you back. There's no reason not to. And I had tried writing some short fiction and prose, with the exception of some very short prose things, didn't really feel that comfortable to me. I'm still kind of grappling with that. But poetry fit really, really well. And so I wrote a poem and I sent it off to, journals and magazines, and it was accepted almost immediately. And that kind of gave me the encouragement, the boost that I needed, that, oh, yeah, I can do this. Someone else out there thinks that this is decent work. And because both as a performer and in my work as a musicologist and theorist, I had specialized in music of the 20th and 21st century and had wanted to be that cellist who went out and premiered all the big new pieces, I was still really drawn to new music and wanted to be involved with new music. And as I started writing poetry, I thought, duh, you can write lyrics. You can write things that are part of new music, Kendra. Come on, you can do this. And another thing that really kind of encouraged me to do it was that I had read this anecdote about Marie Curie late in life, and it immediately occurred to me, I immediately saw this scene where she's on vacation with her daughters at the seaside, and it immediately came to me that this has to be a biographical opera of Marie Curie. And so I started working on a libretto, and that was eventually performed. The opera was done with music by Jessica Rudman. It was performed in 2018 at Hartford Opera Theater. And that, walking into the rehearsal for that and hearing people sing words that I had written and communicate the same things that I had intended in those words, just left me absolutely speechless. And I thought, this is what I need to be doing. I don't need to give up the other aspects of my musical life, but I need to incorporate this in a meaningful way on a regular basis. So when Lisa and I started talking about the idea of short operas, places, opera companies, and people were looking for short works even before the pandemic started. And so I thought, this is exciting. These are pieces that people are really going to want to go hear. People talk about, bringing new audiences to opera, right? A lot of opera companies seem to have this as their brief. And I keep thinking the way to do it is not by setting Wagner in 21st century Manhattan. It's by writing new pieces that are not 4 hours long and full of sexism and racism and anti-Semitism and everything else, right? It's not just restaging old pieces with all of their problems and trying to mitigate those problems. It is creating pieces that don't have those problems, and really promoting those. So I'm just super excited to be doing this.
Yeah, that's great. And you kind of answered my second question there about how this festival specifically came about. I do think it's been happening, definitely since before the pandemic, but this rethinking of opera. And Lisa, like you mentioned, and you, Kendra, I feel like the pandemic kind of sped up that desire to rethink opera and just singing in general, because singing especially was and still is considered especially dangerous in the pandemic, because of the particles. So it's really been interesting to see how this has all been playing out. In terms of this festival, I saw in the press release that you all talked about how you collaborated with the singers themselves to create these like the Wide Awake in New York City. So can we talk a little bit more about how that works, both in terms of the composition and the libretto? How was that? How did that collaboration work with you all?
Yeah. Do you want to start, Kendra, on the libretto side?
Sure. Yeah. So, like you said, we wanted things that could be personal to the singers that they, felt an affinity for. And so Lisa interviewed Hugo Vera and Zach Finkelstein, who do the two pandemic related pieces, about what they might want in those. Because we had a pretty good idea of what we wanted to do for the other three operas. But for them, we wanted to know kind of what was on their minds. And Hugo had just moved to LA and was talking, a lot about how it felt very uncertain to be alone in a new place and to be teaching without ever having met his students face to face and not knowing his colleagues at all and having never even been on campus and things like that. So I worked with him to craft a piece that dealt with those topics. And he also asked if I could include some phrases in Spanish. He wanted to have that aspect as well. So I did that, and then he corrected my grammar, which was good and necessary. And then for Zach's piece, he talked a lot about how he wasn't sure what was going to happen, in the opera world next and where things were going. And he talked about being angry with the companies that had, not fulfilled their end of contracts and had not paid singers and musicians, and would he even trust singing for them again and things like that. So with him, I worked on a piece that is very meta-theatrical, I think in a lot of ways, where he sings the role of the singer who is concerned about these things, right? And he's worried about what's going to happen. And at the very end of everything, there's some uplift because he's able to go get his COVID vaccine. So both of the operas have sort of happy endings. I wanted endings. We're in such a bleak period, and things. It's easy to write things that are just that are emotionally wrought and that are unresolved, or that are left in ways where the audience feels a lot of despair. And that despair is real, and that's not something that I want to brush aside. But at the same time, I wanted these particular pieces to have some kind of hope. I wanted a hope punk ending, kind of, as they say in genre fiction, right? So the opera for Ugo ends with him looking out into the new city and being excited about all the places that he'll be able to go soon, not immediately, but soon. And for Zach, of course, it ends with this uplift of, oh, I can get my vaccine. Things are going to get better. There are still going to be struggles. There's still going to be conflicts over whether I ever go sing for this company again or how I manage this or that. But there's a light, at the end of everything here.
That's great. Lisa, do you want to talk about your part of the collaboration?
Yeah. We always, when all the work we've done, we do always talk as the libretto is being developed and all of that. But then, as it moves into the composition stage, for these pieces, for any pieces, I'm always in contact with who I'm writing for. I always love to talk to them on email or on Zoom or phone about what do they feel they do really well, what makes them say, yes, I love this in a piece, what are some of their favorite pieces. I listen to their recordings. There's a lot of kind of incubation so that I really can hear their voice, or if it's an instrumental piece, they're playing in my ear. And then sending drafts, how is this, up a step, down a step, do you need more preparation? How's this vowel? I'm a singer, so a lot of that stuff comes very easily to me, but there are differences, and as people will hear, we've got two tenors. Ugo and Zach are different tenors, Ugo dramatic, tenor, and then Zach is a very lyric Bach, fantastic choral and choral soloist and other things. So you'll hear that difference. Maggie O'Connell, dramatic mezzo, and I'm on the lighter side. So people will hear that, and so I love to talk about that. And then for me too, I'm always thinking, as I write, I'm always thinking about the theater of it. And I know so is Kendra. Where is there physical action? Where have we left space? Where in a concert piece, it's a different approach because there isn't necessarily going to be that movement. But I think even in a short monodrama, that's important. And the other opera that we developed, really inspired by life events, was me. I'm singing as Catherine Switzer, who famously was the first woman to run as a registered runner for the Boston Marathon. I'm a runner. I ran my first marathon when I was 19. My time was very similar to hers, which is exciting. And that's been a really moving thing for me to work on when we talk about this idea of telling new stories through opera. I don't think I quite realized how much I needed to sing an opera about my love of running and sport until I started to choke myself up singing Kendra's words. So it's really powerful. It's just, I think, storytelling that is connected to our lives, that is connected to the depth and complexity of human experience is really, I think it's really powerful. I can't wait to share that with other people too.
Yeah, I'm super excited to hear all these pieces, and it's like just radiates off of both of you how excited you are about this project. So that makes me even more excited to see them. The one question I had was, and there's different aspects of this that I want to touch on, but to ask about your feelings about the limitations and the opportunities of the virtual format or the online format, however you want to call it, live streaming. So to get your feelings on that, and then also to maybe touch on some of the technical side of it, like are they live? Is it true live streaming, or have they pre-recorded and are going to stream that way? And we were talking about already how Zoom warps the sound. So I guess let's start. I'm sorry to throw, this is very unprofessional of me to throw like 10 questions at you at once.
It's all good.
But I'm really interested to hear both of your viewpoint on the limitations versus opportunities of the virtual format. Let's start there.
Yeah, I think, one of the opportunities is access, so it used to be that to attend a concert outside of, maybe an hour or two radius was a really big hurdle that would be quite difficult for anyone to do. And that also might mean that certain kinds of performance that might be really attractive to some people, they may not have access to based on where they live, and then likewise you might have sort of this niche that can't attract as big of an audience, but could if you had a national audience. So now we have a national audience, and because of the diversity of the careers and the networks of each person involved, we're pooling that. And that was one of the goals of the project, was to share, audience pools and to share enthusiasm and to share across with each other, to bring all that together and the power of that. On the flip side, my feeling really has been throughout this whole year that creating anything now, it takes 4 or 5 times the effort and time for like 1/2 of the length. And in some ways we're leveraging that by keeping things really small. You can watch these operas in 5 to 7 minutes, maybe even less for some of them. But I had my day when I put my microphone in the bedroom where I always put my microphone, and I plugged it in the way I always do, and I did my sound check, and I put on my headphones, and it was cutting out occasionally, and I had to freak out because there's only a few days in the week I can record easily where there's not traffic and there's not this and that, and I've been up for the last 4 hours drinking fluids and warming up and becoming a peak performer. And I'm not going to let that stop me, but it's not easy because it's like getting ready for your marathon and now being told like you got to run around the block for the next 2 hours and fix the car and fix this, and then you can run and you're like, but I was ready to go. So right. I don't know, Kendra, what else can you add? I know you have different perspectives too.
I just want to say that the point that Lisa made about accessibility is really important to me too. As someone who's chronically ill and can't always go to performances, even local ones, being able to watch something that's live or watch something that was recorded yesterday or 3 weeks ago has just opened things up for me. There are all these organizations and performing arts organizations that kept saying, we can't possibly put this online. We can't possibly video this for anybody. We can't, it's just too much. It's too expensive and we don't have the technology, blah, 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 blah. It's right. It's like, if it's not accessible to you, that's your problem. You should, find a way to get out of your house and do it. Right. And now everybody is, oh, of course, we'll put everything online. This is going to be great. And so, it's a silver lining to the pandemic, I think. And I'm really hoping that performing arts organizations and scholarly organizations and everybody, continues to realize that they're reaching a greater audience, that they're able to reach people who, previously would not be able to hear any of these performances or see any of these productions. And that's really important to me. As far as technical aspects and doing the work, I really think I have the easy part. Everything that I do it's done first. Right? Lisa will sometimes come to me and say, I have this idea for a melodic line. Can you write something that will fit it? Or I really want to have this passage somewhere. Can you make sure it fits somehow? And I'm always happy to do that. That's fun for me. Or a singer might say, these words don't really fit well for me, or I have trouble articulating this. Can we change those? But that all happens early. The libretto is one of the first things that happens. Lisa and I will talk about an idea, and we might outline it a little bit about where's the action, what kind of action is it, what does the character want to have happen, or what are they reacting to? So we have all that at the very beginning, and then I write. And while I might make small changes later on, they're always very easy for me to make. I'm not married to any of my words to the point where I'm going to tell a performer, no, you must sing this line that I wrote. It's so perfect and, can never be changed, whatever. So for me, I feel like my role at this point has been, working with publicity and getting things out there for the festival and trying to be supportive of the singers in any way that I can. Although, of course, there's not a whole lot I can really do on a material basis in terms of helping with technology or anything like that. So I'm there for moral support. And as a non-singer, I'm always just overwhelmed by how amazing they all sound. So as some of the singers have made recordings to send to us to preview as we're going into the week before performances. And I just sit there and I'm like, how do you do that? It just sounds so good. And, I've taught at Westminster Choir College, and I've worked with a lot of vocal students at the University of Houston, and I know about vocal production, and I would like to think that I know something about text setting and writing for the voice. At the same time, I'm not a singer. And so there are things to me that are just always kind of like, how do you hit that note? How did you do that? I could hear every word so clearly. That's amazing. So I'm not the person who says, you know what, the microphone faded in just a little bit there and the balance wasn't quite right. And I could hear, your foot moving against the carpet in your studio. I'm not that person with projects like this, in part because, as Lisa said, we're putting in so much time for short pieces, right? I'm not going to be the person, who is like, oh no, we have to record the whole thing over because I could hear your shoelace coming untied in measure 67 or whatever. There are people who will say that, but for this kind of project, that's okay. It's fine. It's perfect just the way it is.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I'm the same way. I think because it's on video, a lot of times the thought is, oh, I have to make this like a recording I would put on a CD or Bandcamp, But the reality is when you're sitting in a performance space watching someone perform, all kinds of weird little things happen, as John Cage famously put on display in his piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Like, we are human beings that make noise, like someone drops their pencil off their music stand, or someone comes in late or unwraps a cough drop. I think I like when I can see the humanity of the performance, because as a performer myself, I know it never, ever goes perfectly. When you're in the studio, you're recording multiple takes and then you cherry pick and then you put it together and you EQ it and you compress it. That's not what live streaming, these live performances are, even if they happen to be in a video format. So as you can tell, I feel passionately about that too.
Yay.
I don't like the nitpicky, I like the idea that you could hear someone's shoelace untying. So, yeah, I guess to expand on that in terms of the day, when they are presented to the public, will these be pre-recorded things that you're streaming, or will they be performing them as a live stream?
Yeah, they'll all be pre-recorded, and then they'll be dropped each day as a YouTube premiere. So at 5:00 Pacific each day, they will have that premiere, moment. If people are able to tune in, they can do all their reactions if they so choose. But then they'll be up to watch in different time zones. You're contacted by some people in Europe who wanted to watch, and 5 p.m. Pacific is like 2 a.m. Central European time. So tune in the next day, and then people. This is grassroots. This was like me and Kendra and 4, I'm one of the singers, 4 of our singing colleagues, saying, let's make something happen with what we have or can reasonably acquire. We are not, a major opera company or a major symphony with a base of donors, with infrastructure for, high def video, with things that we can mail to people, wonderful cameras. I mean, people have done amazing things, even small ensembles, but we're just 6 people. So we looked at a lot of different ways that people have been creating opera and other kinds of pre-recorded concerts. And it can be, and maybe, as people are finalizing their choices this week, as simple as a nice placement of a single camera and a mic and one take. And then for others, for me, I really didn't feel like I could sing as Catherine Switzer running the Boston Marathon without being outdoors and running. And that's not so great for acoustics. So that is going to be more of a video production look, where the audio has been laid down and there will be a couple different takes, and I'll be lip syncing, and it'll be super exciting. And my fiance has been strong-armed into being a cameraman. So it'll be variety, and I think that should be interesting too, for audiences to see what's possible.
I like that idea of the music video. And I think, especially right now when everyone is all, like, as the term goes, Zoom fatigued, I think having them be short productions is actually an advantage, because everyone has been glued to their screen for over a year now. So those short bursts, I think that's great.
Yay!
Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting to know. It'll be sort of a variety. And so each of the performers was responsible for figuring out their staging and recording process and stuff like that.
We each had, Lisa and I had a rehearsal with each performer.
Okay.
Where they could ask us questions about the music or the libretto or the stage directions. I come from a school of putting in very few stage directions because I want performers and directors to have autonomy in making those decisions. I don't want them to be tied down to things that might cause the production not to happen because it's too difficult or too picky or too technical. So we talked to each one of them, and they sort of walked us through how they were going to do their performance. and we looked at different angles and we looked at different options with them. And I think they're all going to be very different. They're all approaching things in different ways, and they all have different technologies and areas, places to use. But I think the end result is going to be 5 really different but equally captivating pieces.
That's really cool. Yeah, I'm so excited to see those. Since we have a little time, I would be interested to hear more about both of your thoughts about the industry. I mean, even if the pandemic hadn't happened, there's a huge reckoning going on in terms of just the music industry, like capital M, but, especially in terms of classical and classical adjacent, how people see it and fund it and things like that. Because for me, I don't drive, which in New York City wasn't a big deal, but now in California is a huge deal. And most people are like, oh, another Zoom concert. And I'm like, yay, I get to go to concerts again.
Right? That accessibility, we need that.
I know. I'm like, please don't stop doing this. When we're back in person, you can stream it. I don't care about if it's the perfect quality or multi-camera. I just want to go,
Yes.
So I'm pretty pro all this, and I do think the technology will catch up eventually in terms of sound. But yeah, I guess it's on my mind because I wrote this post recently about the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, and I guess, but I want to leave it open. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts if you're willing to share, how you see, not just in terms of opera, but the industry in general. Elisa, you kind of touched on it, in terms of freeing up the singer to sing by themselves, which I think is really cool because tying a singer to a piano, which is very 12 notes, whereas a singer can sing this multitude of notes. I just think it's really cool to liberate. Not that I love accompanying and singing to piano, but it's really cool to liberate the voice from that. So yeah, at some point I will stop talking and then you can talk about your feelings about the industry and where you see this going, especially in light of the pandemic. Either one of you.
Kendra, do you want to?
I was going to ask you if you wanted to start off. But, so it's interesting to think about this, especially right now. I've been thinking about this a lot. American Lyric Theater has been putting on a bunch of presentations, I guess webinars, for librettists, and I've been attending these. And they have made me sad because they are so rooted in what people think of as traditional opera. We have to have 3 or 4 acts. We have to have these kinds of characters. We have to have this kind of story. The story has to be told in this particular shape, right? There are these things, right? And I listen to these people who have won Pulitzer Prizes and who are vastly celebrated for their operas. And I think, your operas are boring. I don't want to go to a 4-hour opera, ever. I don't want to do that. As much as I kind of missed dressing up a little bit and leaving the house, I don't miss driving to places. I don't miss all the crowds. There are a lot of things that I don't miss. Meg, like you said, being able to attend these performances without having to drive, without having to worry about all those things, really means a lot to me. And I'm hoping that other people for whom that is a concern will speak up about it. One of the things that I was thinking about recently is how to apply the concept of own voices, which comes from fiction, to opera. And own voices is this idea that maybe white men shouldn't be telling the stories of Black women in opera. Maybe we should find a way so that Black women can tell those stories. And maybe people who are neurotypical shouldn't be telling stories from the point of view of autistic characters. Maybe we should let autistic people like me write those stories or tell those stories, right? So it's not to say that if you're white, you can't write a book that has Black characters in it, but it is to say that we should stop ventriloquizing through the written word. And for me, that includes not just fiction or plays, but also opera libretti. You know, I see all of these pieces that are composed by men who are trying to address things like domestic violence, or issues like this. And I feel kind of uncomfortable with them to a certain extent, right? That I want the industry to sort of think about the emotional effect of that, right? And I see lots of operas, and Lisa and I have talked about this, and I've talked about it with other collaborators as well. Is that Max? He's so fabulous.
Sorry,
I want to write a piece for Max.
That is my cat. I'm so sorry. It's not
I
a
love
baby.
him. I want to write a piece for Voice and Max. We're gonna do this.
Really good projection.
We have recordings of Max that go along with something someone sang.
That sounds awesome.
But I was thinking that there are so many operas that are even modern, recent operas that project messages of abuse and violence that end badly for everyone. And I'm not going to name names about operas here. I'll just say that some of them are based on films and things like that. And I just feel like I don't want to put that out there. I don't want the industry to think that that's all that there is to bring in audiences. I want to write operas that are about resilience and about people who are self-reliant and people who are, you know, self-motivated and groups of people who are supportive and work toward common goals. I want things like that. I want more uplift. And maybe it sounds corny or cheesy. And I've heard people say, no, you can't do that. You just, happy endings are, you know, that's not serious. But I think we can write serious operas that address important issues that don't end, you know, like Hamlet with everybody dead on the stage.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because when you were saying I want to write uplifting and groups of people being resilient and things like that, I was immediately started thinking of musicals. And there is this divide between the musical and the opera. And I see that line kind of blurring, you know, and because I think there are serious musicals and that have an uplifting tone. So I think that's really interesting to think about. What is it opera versus a musical theater piece, and how do those things separate, and why can't opera incorporate some of the themes that are just sort of taken for granted in musical theater? At least that's how I...
So just last night, I was listening to a presentation by Anthony Davis, who was talking about his opera Malcolm X. And he had just started learning about Malcolm X and was reading about him, and somebody said to him, "Oh, you've got to make this a musical." And Davis said, "No, Malcolm X isn't a musical. He's an opera." And I thought, what does it mean? And I'm not criticizing Davis for saying this, because I too, you know, with my Marie Curie opera, I was like, this has to be an opera. This isn't a musical, right? We have this elitist kind of thing ingrained into a lot of us, I think, especially those of us who studied at conservatories, right, where that was what was being taught, was that opera is the pinnacle of voice with orchestra, right? It is somehow higher or better or loftier than the musical. But like you say, Meg, that line between what is a musical and what is an opera has really blurred a lot. And it's still hard for me to think of, oh, I could take this subject, a serious subject, you know, and is it opera? Is it musical theater? What makes the difference there? You know, I think part of what we are talking about there is an audience difference, right? I mean, people don't think of going to see Hamilton as snooty. It's a musical, right? Because it is labeled a musical, right?
But there's also like a singing style thing too.
Right, that too.
That's what I always think.
If you go see Ariadne auf Naxos, oh, it's, you know, we have to put on our ball gowns and, you know, arrive in a limo or whatever. It's this whole cultural... it's cultural baggage. You know, I think we have to sort through it. I think there's a lot of sorting to be done. not to put things in categories, but to figure out why we feel the way we do about the categories that we label certain genres with.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you. Thank you for that. And yeah, Lisa, I think I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too, but you already sort of touch on a topic, which is singing style. Mm-hmm. And I think as a singer, I'm really curious to hear your take on this thing that we just sort of accidentally landed on, which is the musical theater opera thing. Like, what is your take as a singer in terms of that? The divide?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's so fascinating is, we are starting to see institutions that in the past taught exclusively classical techniques start to, bring in a wide variety of singing techniques. We have this fancy word, contemporary commercial music, or CCM styles. And many classically trained singers and teachers of voice are trying to learn that so we can empower our students who are coming to us and wanting to sing in those. So in that way, I think that's great, because if you set up shop and say, I'm going to teach voice, and you have, 7 out of 10 students coming to you saying, I don't want to learn opera, I want to learn musical theater, or I want to learn jazz, then it's incumbent on you, if you take them, to know what to teach them. And I mean, that's your responsibility as a teacher, And then on the other hand, I know that we specialize, and I'm a triathlete. I'm a triathlete who comes in as a runner first, a cyclist second, and a swimmer way third. And this is how every triathlon goes for me. If you can look at your ranking, leaving the water, leaving the bike, and then at the end, it ends with the run. And I pass so many people on that run. I pass these guys they've got these big biker thighs, and they are just, they were even slower than me in the swim, right? So what does this tell me? I believe in cross training, and I also think that when you talk about opera singing, which is elite athletics, it's normal that some people learn a certain set of musculature, a certain style. It becomes a default, and maybe those people can easily switch, and some of them may not easily switch. Why do I write opera? Because I have friends who are classical musicians, and because I, for one geeky, strange, who knows why reason, I just really love the sound, and I love musicals too. But that legato sound, those overtones, turning your head into an amp, there's no other way to do it. All the other things are super cool, but all those other styles that we really think about, the popular music styles that we really think about now, are mic'd styles that wouldn't carry. And that doesn't make them lesser or better. It just means there's a reason why in the 1600s we started to develop this style. And it's kind of a dorky, geeky thing to be in love with, but I do love it. Yeah, so I don't know, there's a whole bunch of thoughts. There's also how do you get a musical made versus how you get an opera produced? Really, I mean, different, neither better nor worse. I love working with acoustic musicians in real time, which I know is not exactly what we're able to do at this moment in the pandemic. But I love that. I love it as a performer. I love it as a composer. I'm not personally as excited as a performer or as a composer about singing to a synth orchestra, or about having to pace my rubato off of something played back, which is not all musical theater, and it may even be some classical, but it is some, right? It is some. And the thing that I really love to make, if I think about my passion projects, it is like a black box style, small, cool space live music performance with classically trained and other adjacent artists. That's just my dorky skill set and group of friends right now. Maybe in the future we'll write a musical, Kendra. That would be fun. Yeah, but whenever people say, well, why isn't Phantom of the Opera an opera? I say, because they're mic'd, and because they don't, Christine sings pretty operatically, but even she's changing her vowels. She's singing not as operatically as an opera singer would, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a stylistic difference,
Right. Yeah. It's interesting maybe the chief difference here is the physicality of the singer as they're producing sound,
Yeah,
because
the overtones. Yeah.
right, yeah, and that idea of creating a microphone inside yourself. Because I remember when I went from singing quasi opera, I trained technically as that for a little while until I realized I just did not have the voice for it. But when I switched that to microphone, I was like, whoa, this is a totally different ball game, in terms of if you try to sing like an opera singer in front of a microphone, you're just going to blow out the PA, it's just not going to sound good. So you have to completely adjust the way you think about sound production.
Yeah.
If you're using a microphone. But it's interesting you mention that black box space, because I think that is where the two genres can kind of get mushy when you have that freedom really to just have a blank space and you have your live musicians, instrumentalists there to play off of and stuff. And maybe you can have a blend of different singers and the microphone isn't as much of an issue because the space is smaller.
Yeah.
But yeah, also in terms of just production, that's where and I know you all are thinking about this too. And I think Zach's opera, it sounds like it's like, this is how are these things going to be funded, especially when staid, institutions are unwilling to upset their board members or certain donors by breaking out of a lot of like what you were talking about, Kendra, these very narrow conceptualizations of what opera is. For me, that's the big question mark, is like how much longer will this kind of outdated model sustain itself?
The Met is basically about the collapse.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
People have been calling for Peter Gelb's resignation for a really long time, but the singers haven't been paid. The musicians aren't getting paid. They're getting locked out. That's huge. Other opera companies are stating their solidarity with Met musicians rather than the administration there.
Yeah.
I think we are probably going to see smaller companies emerge. Companies that maybe don't need huge sets, right? How much did the Met pay for the machine, right? That's used for all of the Wagner operas, right? The machine, right? It's cool.
French fries.
I guess, right? But the cost of it is obscene. When you think about how many musician salaries and how many singer salaries you can pay because you wanted to have this big, cool thing, because you needed to show off how much money you had, but you didn't want to put it in your people. You wanted to put it in your material stuff. So when Lisa talks about the black box theater, that's exactly, what I think of what I'm writing for. I'm a Shakespearean scholar as well, and I look at Shakespeare plays, which have very few stage directions, and yet get amazing productions of all sorts of imaginative things because they don't have those directions, right? Because they're basically for a black box where you can do whatever you want. So I really think we're going to see smaller companies that come out of sort of regional organizations. I think we're going to see companies that put money into tech and do online productions only, maybe doing, and that will involve people from all over the world, and they'll have funding to do that, I think, because they're so distributed, right? Because local supporters in a variety of areas are going to be interested in that because it will go out online to everyone. It won't just be, we're only going to show it in Houston or whatever. So I think companies are going to change quite a bit. At least I'm hoping. I'm hoping that we don't go back to what we had before, where it's just big companies ruled by their boards and by donors who aren't interested in changing things in any kind of really meaningful way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go for it.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the powerful things about going small, we knew when we did this project, we weren't going to be making up for anybody's, lost salary level gigs with our pay as you can system. It was sort of an effort first, we get paid last sort of thing, a labor of love. But, when you go small, a lot of things are possible because you're centering it in the artists and in their vision. And the conversations that came up with, Audrey and with Maggie and with me and Kendra as we designed mine and with Zach and Ugo were, what is it you wish you could sing about? And since no one else gets to decide, we get to decide. And, all those stereotypes Kendra was mentioning, those are bad for men too. I mean, yes. I have a dear friend who's a bass baritone, and he's told me, like, I'm so tired of seeing the sleazy guy. Like, I don't want to be this person. Right. It's not interesting. It's not helping anyone. It's kind of gross. I'm bored with it. It's not fulfilling, and so, you need
to write an opera for him.
Yeah, we totally do, and we have an opera being premiered this summer, virtually with Opera Elect, that's about a woman and her breast cancer diagnosis. And as we were writing it, we couldn't believe there wasn't a more prominent breast cancer opera that we could think of. Probably there is a tiny, amazing one somewhere that we just haven't aggregated. But, I think the power of, if you go short and tiny and your budget is small, you don't need as many donors. Anybody can fund that. It's like the consortium commissions model for producing. So I have a lot of hope in artist-centered work. And then, with complete transparency, this artist-centered work that is a labor of love, it means we all have other jobs. As artists often do, it's not a magic bullet, but I also think when paying work got canceled, when there wasn't art to make, or there wasn't as much, when the gig calendar dried up last year, there's a whole set of people who didn't have the energy to do something creative as a passion project. Totally get it. I had periods like that too. And then there was another group of people, or there were different times for those people where there was a great desire to create, to channel their brilliance, and that need was there to share something. So we can do that. I don't have a complete economic fix for everyone, but I know we can do that as one part of our work, while we also do other kinds of work to feed ourselves and to put money into our retirement accounts, which is also important.
To feed Max.
To feed Max, yes, who's now somewhere else happy.
Yeah, that is. You landed right where I've been sitting for a long time, but especially since the pandemic, and I see all my performer friends, the reaction as the months went on, and the gigs just kept getting canceled and then not scheduled at all because it was going on and on, is this idea that, yeah, we all are, most of us make art in the cracks of life. We have our paying work, and we have our home responsibilities and family responsibilities. And then we find these times, often shoehorning in these times to follow our passion. And like you say, that can be very liberating. And it's certainly, I think, better than the huge status board. Let's be honest. That's why you're on a board usually of a huge institution, is for status. Or donating is the same thing. There's a lot of freedom not having those structures in place. But yeah, there really has to be a middle ground there where maybe we can make some money. I make very, very little money on Bandcamp, but I do. It's a trickle of money on Bandcamp, and I think that especially the classical and classical adjacent, we have to find a way that the passion can also just, at least at first, trickle in the money. And I think I was really glad that you all were charging for this.
Thank you.
Because I think that's important to, especially at first when we were all figuring out how to do all these things. I say we, like everyone else, I have not attempted to try to figure it out. It was like, oh, it's free because it's not live and we don't know what we're doing. But I think now we're at a point where everyone deserves to get something, so I think that was good. I think that's a really good place to stop. I think it is this kind of, it's tempered, but there is this like hopeful place that we're all in where it's like, oh, we get to make these things that are important to us. Like you say, artist-centered. Do you all have anything else you want to mention about the festival or anything else before we stop?
I do want to invite people to the Talkback. One of the things that we're offering at the end, you watch the operas whenever you like. They drop at 5 Pacific, Monday through Friday. But then on Friday, March 26th, at 5:10 Pacific is a Zoom Talkback moderated by Gina Morgano, the host of the Practice Parlor podcast. And it's an opportunity for people to come hang out with us, lift a glass, ask your questions, get to know the artists. We'll have, I believe, everyone there, or maybe minus one person depending on scheduling. And so that is our live component. And it is also pay as you can, but you do have to sign up to get the link because we are limited to a number of people that we can have in our Zoom room. So that would be my last little piece of info for people.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I meant to mention that. Kendra, anything else?
I'm just really excited to have these pieces out in the world and performed by such great people. We've got runners, we've got a golfer, we've got a woman who's a swordswoman, and I had wanted to write an opera about, swordsmanship. As a former competitive fencer and fencing coach, I was so excited to do that one. We even did a stage combat lesson with the singer over Zoom. Cool. And we've got all of these pieces that are about resilience and perseverance. And I just want to invite people to come and sort of revel in that feeling because we all need it and we all deserve it.
Thanks for joining me on Sound Meets Sound. Be sure to click on the links in the description to learn more about Kendra and Lisa and to get tickets for the festival.